I was at a lunch the other day, and there was a woman there. She's from New York City, and she said I was speaking at this lunch and had been speaking probably for 30 to 45 minutes, and sat down with this woman from New York. She's probably 90, and if you've ever been in the company of 90-year-olds, you know that they're not shy in telling the truth. So I said to her, Ethel, what'd you think of my speech, Ethel? And she said, it was lovely, Justin. It was absolutely lovely. But I think you missed 2 opportunities to sit down. So hopefully, if I've missed an opportunity to sit down, let me know. But I wanted to talk to you. Dennis had asked me to come and talk about networking. And I really wanted to, in the short period of time that I have, to kind of cover the basics. A lot of us talk about networking, but I don't really think we all know what it is. I've read a lot of books and have been in the field with a lot of people who teach about networking, and they've certainly taught me a lot. But I often find that a lot of them teach about how to work a room or what is small talk. And as important as those things are, I don't really think they cover the range and scope of what networking is. So hopefully, I'm always about the basics, and hopefully these principles work for you, because networking is always about, it's always about you. And what's going to work for you is not always going to work for the person next to you. And hopefully, I'll give you some great examples of that. So in terms of networking, what is it? And I'm asking anybody. Connecting with people. What else? Your sphere of friends, contacts. Anybody else have their definition of networking? There's no right or wrong answer here. That's right. Hopefully you can answer that question when I'm done. But networking, yes, it's connecting. It's building a sphere of friends, of contacts, of people that you want to know. And there are 3 things here that I really wanted to point out about what networking is. And that is, how do you plan to achieve your goals? When you go and you're looking for jobs and you're looking for internships, particularly in turbulent times like these, it can be very demoralizing, particularly in this year and in times like these, if you've ever experienced them. But the whole premise to your entire career is always going to be about people. Machines aren't going to run your life. You're not going to have a boss who is a robot. And so you're always going to need to connect with people, to talk to them, to have a conversation. And it's funny, we were talking about this. There's a quote from Oscar Wilde that talks about conversation and how it's the basic necessity of human life is the act of conversation. And so there's something so powerful about the act of conversation, the act of connecting, that happens. And I would say that networking is really the wrong word to use. For me, for my personal definition, it's really relationship building. It's an opportunity to engage in a relationship. And that's really what becomes important, what brings us to the forefront of networking. And you do it. How many are on Facebook? How many have a Facebook account? Me included. And I'm quite the user of Facebook too. I'm always on it. I'm probably, people would call me a stalker on Facebook, but there's an opportunity to connect there, and you've done it. And in fact, most of the people that are on your Facebook account are people that you've connected with already in person, face to face. And so the act of conversation is really important. Even in online, we were talking about bosses. You can't promote yourself. Someone's going to promote you when you get into a job. You can't hire yourself. Someone's going to hire you. Your entire career is going to be predicated on people. And the same thing with online hiring. There are jobs that I know of. When I was working at the University of Pittsburgh, I was asked to serve on several hiring committees. And on those committees, we would receive applicants. Sometimes for one job, we received anywhere between 200 and 800 applicants. It depended on the type of job. And so kind of cutting through all of that, all of those applicants really was hard. And certainly it helped if we knew one of the applicants, if we knew some of them. And so it became extremely fruitful that we knew people. And in terms of online hiring, that's what makes it very hard, because you don't know how many applicants there are. And so networking really comes to the forefront. And again, I think I've really explained why it's important. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about is networking isn't anything that is mechanical. It's not something that you always plan out. Although some networking connections that you do make are strategic, it can be very organic. Some things happen by accident. I met a woman who, I was on a bus in Philadelphia, and I met this woman, and we just happened to be talking on the bus. We were engaging in some small talk, and she said, "Oh, I'm originally from Pittsburgh." And I said, "Oh, that's where I'm living now." I was living in Squirrel Hill at the time, and so we connected. It turns out she happened to be the assistant dean to the Tepper School of Business. So you never know where these connections will happen, and we still keep in touch. But it was just one of those opportunities. It's an accident, but it certainly happens. And I'm certainly not giving you advice to talk to every single person that you can on the bus. But there are things there that really that happen, and they happen by accident. And there are opportunities that you may be missing. And like I said, people make things happen, not machines. But the other thing I really like about networking and connecting and talking about it is it's really an opportunity to give back. Every connection that you make with someone is an opportunity to be generous. And that's one of the pillars that I'm really going to talk about, is that networking is all about generosity, because it's not a me activity. It's an us activity. It's about us in a relationship. In that conversation, it's about me listening. It's about me talking. It's about sharing. And I think that's something really important about networking. People think, oh, it's taking advantage of someone. It's being outgoing. And that's not what networking is. It's just the simple act of conversation. And we can make that happen strategically. So back to the basics. I'm like I said, all about the basics. Networking is something that you already have. There is nothing wrong with you. If you think that you're a bad conversationalist, stop it. You're not. Everyone networks differently. And so it's about networking for yourself. And a lot of people will tell me, oh, well, I'm an introvert, and I don't think that I'm a good networking. Well, that's not true. You just network differently than an extrovert. And a lot of people see extroverts as these people who can talk to 8 people at once and laugh and carry on. And that may be the case. And introverts can do that too, but sometimes they find energy out of talking one-on-one. It's a one-on-one process with an introvert, or it's engaging in a deeper conversation. So you already have what it takes to network. It's, like I said, not about advantage or usury. It's an opportunity to engage in conversation. And it can be a fun, positive experience. It's not something that you have to do. It's something that you already do. How do you think you found your friends in college? You were networking. And some of that probably happened by accident. Some of it probably happened in a more structured manner. You shared a class. You were majors together. But either which way, you had already networked, and you already are networking. And hopefully, these tenets will refine that a little bit. These are 4 tenets of networking that I consider extremely important. One being generosity, giving back. Audacity, taking risks. There are always opportunities to take risks, and sometimes it's those risks that have the bigger payoff. Vulnerability. It's kind of a word we don't talk about a lot in networking literature. A lot of the books I read rarely talk about vulnerability, but I think it's so important. And accountability. And this is something that if you don't do, you will fail at. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. Generosity. You always have something to give. And people go, well, I'm only a student. What do I have to give? Well, you don't have to certainly give the change out of your pocket. But you do have things to give. And I break these up into two different points. Universal currency. I call this is the currency by which everyone has it. It's the opportunity to encourage someone, to share advice about something. Is anyone in here an athlete? Okay, and I'm sure you've got training and conditioning, right? Well, there are people who are always looking to improve their health, and your advice probably would be extremely, extremely welcomed by people who are twice your age, 3 times your age, whatever the case may be. You always have something to give. So that's what we talk about with universal currency, compassion and listening. Listening is really an act of giving. It says, I understand you, I hear what you're saying, and you are understood. And a lot of times, psychologists will say that's one of the primary motivations of humans in their social realm, is just to simply be understood. And then personal currency. What are these tangible things that we talk about in terms of being able to give? I always say that there are 3 things, and this came from advice from someone else, but there are 3 things that people consider to be primarily important. Health, wealth, and children. And that is to say, people's healths are important to them. How can they be the best, both physically in terms of wellness, emotionally? How can they be the best? Their wealth. How can you make them richer? Or how can you make them better off than they were? And that's not just even in terms of money, but it's in terms of their careers. How can you help improve their careers? And then children. People have an extreme concern about their children, and rightfully so. It's their pride, their joy, and so they take a lot into their children. And you helping them is always an act of generosity in this regard. There was a story, I don't know if anybody has ever read Keith Ferrazzi, Never Eat Alone, but it's a book I highly recommend. And he said, one of the things that I had done, I actually met Keith and had dinner with him, but he said one of the things that we had done, I was interested in meeting Jack Valenti, and Jack Valenti is a pretty powerful executive. I believe he was with MGM Studios, but he was interested in meeting with him, and Keith lives on the West Coast. And Keith had found out, and this was, again, by accident, he had met Jack Valenti's son, and Jack Valenti's son was interested in marketing, and Keith used to be the CEO of Starwood Hotels, which governs the Sheraton brand. And so he had said, oh, well, come over to my office. I'll give you, we can talk about it. I'm happy to talk about where you're going in life, and certainly, however it is I can help you. So they had met, and unbeknownst to Keith, he had met Jack Valenti later on through the months. He had met Jack Valenti, and his son had told Jack what Keith had done, and so Jack was very, very impressed by Keith, and certainly had already stricken up a conversation. Any English majors here? But anyway, he had really begun a conversation with him immediately because of that connection. And again, that happened by accident. But those are things that we can always give and certainly be generous toward. And another is sharing your contacts. You know other people, and you certainly have your own network. So being able to connect people and engage them in a conversation is always an act of generosity. Audacity. We go to these events, these networking events. Some events are just networking events by accident or as a byproduct. They're fundraisers, they're award dinners. But it takes a lot of courage to network. And so it takes a lot of risk, it takes a lot of audacity. And it's sometimes taking those risks that really bring you to someplace different, that bring you to a place in terms of connecting with someone that you had never been previously, or that you wouldn't have been had you not taken that risk. And so I would always encourage you to take it, and I call it a calculated risk. You're certainly not going over the edge, but you're taking a risk in terms of just talking to someone, introducing yourself. I read once that oftentimes the reason we are nervous as a society in events and in networking events and connecting with people is really historically comes from the 19th century, from the Victorian era, when in order for a lady, for example, of society to be introduced to another lady or another gentleman, they had to be mutually introduced by someone that they had known. And bar that, they wouldn't otherwise meet, because it really required an act of introduction throughout Victorian society. And we have still embedded that fear of, well, I need someone to introduce me, or I need to be introduced to this person before I can connect. And so, again, it certainly takes a lot of risk. But when I say audacity, I also mean it on a bigger picture, too. Finding a role model. Find someone that you admire. And I'm sure that they come pretty easily, even with you in college. There are plenty of role models to ask and say, could we do lunch? Could we do coffee? I'm very interested in hearing and learning from you. One of the things that I've done, when I graduated from college, I worked at Ariba in downtown Pittsburgh, and then I went to the University of Pittsburgh, and now I've ended up at Seton Hill. But one thing that I've always done since I have been at each place was to find a role model. For example, the vice president of global management at Ariba, I just simply asked him, I said, would you be interested in doing lunch? I want to hear about what your leadership style is. What is it that makes you the leader that you are? And I did the same thing with vice provost at Pitt. It was just something, and it's something that I've done, and I've actually done it at Seton Hill too. But there are always people who are willing to guide you and give you guidance and support. So that, I think, is really important. Speaking, if you feel like you aren't very outgoing, I think speaking and finding opportunities to speak. There are plenty of opportunities for you to speak on campus. There are organizations like Toastmasters that will help you in that endeavor. But it is so interesting because I think speaking really gives you an opportunity to relax when you're in a social setting. When you have to talk to 20, 30, 40, 50 people, talking to 8 doesn't really seem that bothersome. Volunteer, get involved. You might have a favorite nonprofit or cause that you're interested in. Become more involved in that. That can be something that's really important. And lastly, practicing. Just practice networking. Go out and do it. Practice, practice, practice. It's the only way that you'll become a good networker. And you might not become a great networker, or you might not be a great networker or think that you're not at the beginning, but I'm pretty sure the more and more you do it, the easier it will become. Vulnerability. This is something that a lot of people don't really talk about, but I think it's important because it's something that can really, again, conversation. You're human. You're organic. There's something very human about you, and vulnerability, isn't necessarily coming down with the blues and saying, "Oh, I don't have a job. I haven't been in a job for 12 months. Can you get me something?" That's not what I'm really talking about as much as I am saying that it's an opportunity to really talk about what are your dreams, what is your passion, your goals. Those are all things that require vulnerability. No one really enjoys telling a stranger, what their passion and their dreams and their goals are. It's something that we often reserve for our friends, that we keep intimate. And again, not that you always have to tell everybody your goals and your dreams, but it's an opportunity to really relinquish who you are to someone and say, I'm putting myself out there. I'm taking that risk. I'm being audacious again in networking. because it's about who you are. You're inviting someone in, and that's the best example I can give of what vulnerability is. It's an invitation to you in telling people who you are. And oftentimes I put the point that we're conditioned to sell ourselves as products. I'm this, I do this, and I can do this, this, and this for you. Well, that's great, but did you even start that conversation out with listening to the person that you're talking to? Or we are more than just, I can do this, this, and this. I have feelings. I'm someone who really has a story to tell. And how can I tell that story? And how can I integrate that story with someone else's story? And lastly, the important thing to me, this is probably, to me, the number one commandment of networking, is following up. Follow up, follow up, follow up. You know, networking is, to me, actually the easiest part of this whole session. I think I would rather spend the entire session on follow-up rather than networking, because I think networking can be the easy part. It's the follow-up that's the hard part, especially when you're in college and you've got exam papers and you've got 8 million priorities going on, you have practice, you have all of your clubs. When do you find the time to follow up? And so this becomes really important. But it also shows that you're reliable, that someone can trust in you. Are you going to do what it is that you said that you were going to do? If you can do simply that act, then it really carries the conversation in a movement forward. And it's also about, in terms of following up, keeping that follow-up. So it's not just the initial follow-up, but it's also keeping that for months at a time, for years. You want to build lifelong relationships, and certainly this is where it happens. Like I said, networking is the fun part, but follow-up is really where the work happens. And that can happen in several ways. Christmas cards, for example, a lot of people like to follow up with Christmas cards, and I'm not a fan of that for two reasons. One is that everyone gets them, and two, there might be cultural sensitivities that you might not understand. And so I've actually sent a lot of my friends that I've developed over the years New Year's cards, just as a simple follow-up. How many of you have ever gotten a New Year's card? Exactly. So I think that it says a lot about, you know, you really stick out because people get 30, 40 million Christmas cards, but whoever gets a New Year's card. But there are ways for you to be creative about follow-up. You know, let's say that you're having a meeting with someone in their office, or they ask you to meet with you in their office, and they have an assistant. Call their assistant up, or call them up and say, "Hey, I'm stopping at Starbucks. Would you like something from there?" I mean, there are acts of generosity when you're following up, but all of this comes together to say that follow-up is really the most important key here in regards to networking. And I didn't want to give you a lot of tips and tricks, but because I think that really these basics are the most important part.